You should see me now.
Hey, hi, how are you? Brian Lilly here at the Nectarine. Actually, I'm in the studios of News Talk 580 CFRA in the nation's capital, in Ottawa. That's where I host my nightly radio show, which gets underway in about half an hour's time. So, after this is done, you want to enjoy some great conservative conversation, you can join me there at CFRA.com or on the iHeartRadio. Just watching my old friend John Bolton uh, being up on TV out of the United States because he's talking about how the U.S. is pushing back against the International Criminal Court. And when I say my old friend John Bolton, I'm not joking. Yeah, it's weird that I know people inside the Trump administration, and yet I do. Hosted John on one of his cross Canada speaking tours, interviewed him many times, including down in Washington, D.C. at CPAC, and good to see him doing so well as the national security advisor to U.S. President Donald Trump. One person that's not doing well in the discussions with U.S. President Donald Trump is our Prime Minister, Trudeau. I gave Trudeau solid points. I gave him props for a long time in terms of how he was handling Donald Trump and the U.S. administration. Because let's face it, like Trump, hate Trump. Nobody disagrees that negotiating is difficult. Do you want to be on the side of negotiations with Donald Trump? The answer is likely no. Doesn't matter if you hate him or you love him. This guy's going to be a tough negotiator. And so we're in the middle of dealing with NAFTA. And I thought that Trudeau and his Foreign Affairs Minister, Chrystia Freeland, our Foreign Affairs Minister, Chrystia Freeland, was doing a not bad job. And then things started to fall apart. And we're not doing very well right now. In fact, they basically didn't talk to us from the end of May, just before the G7. The G7 was on June 7th. They cut off talks about a week before that. So from the end of May until the end of August, we didn't have any talks with the Americans. They spent the summer talking to the Mexicans, hammered out a deal with them, and then they said, hey, Canada, you want to sign on? Not the best way to put it. I want to bring in Brent Stafford. He is a conservative columnist and pundit out in the left coast out in British Columbia. And you can find his work writing at the Nectarine. And his latest piece opens up with, let's face it, Canada is screwed. That's a pretty blunt opening statement there, Brent.
Yeah, designed to make a point.
And what point is that? Where are you going with this?
Well, there's a certain degree of blame that I'd like to assign to every single person who voted for the Prime Minister, for every single Canadian that believes in squishy progressive values. This is what's got us into this mess. It's not just Trudeau. It's the entire progressive values movement.
Look, you also take aim at our Foreign Affairs Minister, and I keep calling her Foreign Affairs Minister, even though they've changed the title to Global Affairs, because heaven forbid we use an offensive word like foreign. Chrystia Freeland, you say she has no business or trade experience. What do you mean? She tanked a whole division at Thomson Reuters.
That is true. I know I feel pretty bad about doing that, considering that I'm from the profession. But I've been in this profession for 30 years. And as you know, Brian, that we can fake a lot of knowledge and expertise, but yet hold none. And she is in charge of negotiating NAFTA with President Trump. And you take a look at her background, and she just doesn't have the kind of trade experience that you'd expect to negotiate these, huge agreements. Not only that, but I'm not certain she has the temperament for the mundane minutia that is required for trade agreements. They're not flashy.
I was speaking with Frank Buckley the other day. He is a law professor out of, and I love the name of this school, the Scalia Law School at George Mason University, named after the late, great Supreme Court jurist in the United States, Antonin Scalia. And Frank's a dual citizen. He's Canadian, living and working in the States for years. Now he's an American citizen as well. And I was getting his take on it, and he said, after Chrystia Freeland went down to Washington, D.C. in mid-June, it was a week after Trudeau had already annoyed Trump at the G7. Chrystia Freeland goes down and completely annoys Donald Trump with her speech where she's virtue signaling the whole time and denouncing his administration without naming him. Frank told me that she was effectively cut out from the White House. She had had some meetings with White House officials, not with the president, but with White House officials. And Trump said she will not step foot inside this building again. That's not a good way to go around negotiating, is it?
No, it's not. And I think that's what's so troubling about all of this, because the seriousness in which our federal government should be taking with regard to negotiating NAFTA, they're just not doing it. And, early on, when they brought gender equality to the table as a part of the trade negotiations, I certainly noticed that. I wrote about it. Was very upset about it. But what can you do? You just kind of hope that the reasoned heads will prevail and they'll get down to negotiating the things that need to happen to keep our economy going with our largest trading partner down south, and who we share plenty of national security issues with too as well. Instead, they've gotten overwhelmed by that need to virtue signal. And I see it as no surprise that it's a badge of honor to be kicked out of the White House. It's a badge of honor to earn President Trump's scorn. And we just can't afford to play that game with regard to NAFTA and our economy.
Look, I'm very proud of my brother for being kicked out of Russia because he wouldn't pay a bribe. And I give full kudos to Freeland and a whole pile of Canadians, including Andrew Scheer and James Bazan on the conservative side, kicked out. They're persona non grata in Russia because they called Putin out on his crap, and I'm good with that. But you don't want to be persona non grata at the White House. I mean, for goodness sakes, it's one thing if it's some guy that's out invading Ukraine and you're calling him out on it. It's another thing. You're like, so we'd like to keep selling you 90% of the cars we build, but you're a bad man. That's not going to get you anywhere.
No, it's not. There's a word that I like to use to describe this behavior, and it's petulant. And that really is what's happening here. It's funny, when you were talking about Russia, it brought to mind something that the foreign minister, the global minister, global affairs minister said, I believe last summer in French, in responding to an interview while in Europe. And she spoke about Canada's deep, deep affection for European values. And I think that's ultimately the problem here, because Trump represents a return to a celebration, or defending at least, of Western values, whereas the Trudeau government is intelligentsia, and the intelligentsia.
They want to be the continent.
That's right.
They're not interested in what came out of the British tradition, out of the Westminster tradition, which gave way to America. And America is an extension of that tradition. They want to be Germany and France and Sweden. They want to be the socialist states. By the way, speaking with Brent Stafford, longtime journalist, pundit, author, you can read him at the Nectarine. And if you like what you're seeing, make sure that you're clicking share on Facebook. I'm not seeing enough shares on Facebook, so make sure you're clicking share on Facebook or retweeting on Twitter, what have you. And of course, I'm in the studios of News Talk 580 CFRA. You can join me after this is done. You can join me on the radio show there. Brent, you're out on the West Coast, and out here in Ontario, we are obsessed with the auto industry. A huge part of our trade with the United States. It's not that big a deal for you guys. In Quebec, but I mean, I'm sure that you could understand if it went away, that would be an awful lot of unemployed Canadians. But in Quebec, they're obsessed with supply management, which is, there's maybe like 1,300 farmers in British Columbia, if my memory serves correct, that are dealing with that are part of that system. But in Quebec, they're obsessed with it. And they would rather see the whole deal go down than tinker with supply management. What's that issue dealt with? What has it felt like out in British Columbia dealing with this issue that could, trip up everything related to trade we do with the United States?
Excellent question, Brian. It's something I was thinking about this morning because, quite frankly, out here on the West Coast, we don't think about supply management at all. That whole issue, there's zero political interest in that. Outside of, say, softwood lumber, which always comes up as a sticking point with the Americans, there isn't really a lot of that really tweaks for us. I mean, we're resource side. So when a conservative government gets into power federally, we're all happy generally, usually, because there's more of a focus on resources and we do better. And then, of course, when a more liberal or left-wing kind of orientated government comes in federally, then, of course, there's more interest in preserving the manufacturing sector in Ontario. Quebec, you're asking a British Columbian if we're concerned with Quebec. I almost don't want to answer that question because any way that I would be a pejorative, because of course we don't. We just don't. But let me bring this up on Quebec, and this is going to be a little bit hot, I think. But I think there's some just rewards here that are going on to Quebec. They for years have stoked identity politics. They have stoked the division in this country. And they obviously share, and rightly so much power in our confederation. But yet here they are about to get stabbed in the back by the progressive monster that they've helped to create over the last 60, 70 years. So anyhow, so as a British Columbian, I don't have a lot of tears for expensive milk.
Although you do pay for it.
Yes, I do.
Groceries in Vancouver. I know what it's like. It ain't cheap. Brent, let me ask you about this. The divide in British Columbia, because, you've got a view of Quebec that I think is actually more properly a view of Montreal. Because let me tell you, you go into what they call in Quebec the regions, and you'd feel very at home, other than the fact that I don't know how your French is, but, probably about as good as their English. But my experience is people get along. But downtown Montreal is a completely different animal. And I feel the same way about British Columbia. British Columbia is all about, they love Catherine McKenna, and they want to stop straws from going into the ocean. And this is their biggest issue. And they want to stop pipelines. And then you talk to people outside of Vancouver, and guess what? They have family members that work in the resource sector, and they want resource sector jobs. Talk to me about that divide in BC.
Well, it's certainly there, and I do agree with you. It's that urban divide with the interior. It's a bit troubling though, because British Columbia is not going to be able to last that long unless it can keep its resource industry alive. There isn't enough of it here. And I fear that the environmental, the social justice movement, and everything else is making some serious inroads into a lot of British Columbia. I mean, you have to imagine that it's a very big province and there's not a lot of population anywhere compared to over there. So the balance between those that would vote out resources is slowly or quickly, maybe even, depending on how you want to look at it. And here's what concerns me the most, Brian. If this referendum goes through this fall that allows a change in our electoral politics here in British Columbia, it's going to make it just all that much more easier, obviously, to have a string of minority governments, and it's going to be an anti-resource province, and it could be in perpetuity.
We're just looking right now, and the population of British Columbia is 4.6 million. Vancouver proper, people don't realize this. Vancouver proper is actually very small. It's 647,000. It's smaller than Ottawa, but the Vancouver area is about 2.4. So about half the province, population-wise, lives in that region that is going to vote for those social justice warriors for that left-wing vision. Are they going to vote Justin Trudeau in or out? I mean, do you have enough people that are upset at him because he is going to try and build the pipeline, and enough people that are upset at him that he hasn't built the pipeline? Where does it stand?
Well, first of all, I think that you have to separate those voters that vote based on whether or not the incumbent is competent or not. And if it's a voter that likes competence as an issue, then they probably won't vote for him. If it's somebody that doesn't place competence as a high issue, which of course gets you into social justice and everything else, then that's just the simple fact: competency or not competency. And so whether or not that's valued. I think on the other hand, we're going to have an election in 2019 that won't have the legalization of cannabis on it. And so many Canadians voted for Trudeau, not even thinking about it, just on the promise of legal pot. And they weren't thinking beyond that.
Conservative MP that lost in the last election from the Vancouver area, and she said she sent people out to her local polling booths. How are we doing? And they called in and said, we're done, because they just looked around the room and they saw people that were voting specifically on pot.
Yeah.
And that's the only reason they were out. Now, they're going to be very angry on October 17th when they find out there's more ways to be charged with pot offenses under the new law than there is under the old law.
I know.
But that's another.
Well, it's no surprise that they weren't, forward thinking.
Mm-hmm. So, competence versus incompetence. So you described liberal versus conservative voters. Conservatives like competence. Liberals want to feel inspired towards something. In terms of where British Columbia is heading, are they still backing Trudeau as a group, or is there a split, a divide?
Well, I'm not too certain about the recent polling, but you could count on the interior to be very dissatisfied. So there would be more people in the interior who had voted for Liberals in this last round who would be very upset. There's no doubt about it. But you made a good point about Metro Vancouver. It went so heavy for the NDP. I mean, it was a wipeout almost for the BC Liberals in the urban ridings here. And the NDP is not going to lose its grip on that. So I don't think that you're going to see a lot of Conservatives candidates be able to claw back in the greater Vancouver area, which is a problem, no doubt. Back in the 2015 election and the run-up to it, I felt that, and I said this on air and in my columns several times, that, if Harper had already put in place all the mechanics of legalization of marijuana, it looked like he was almost going to do it. So many pro-marijuana people, and that's obviously a huge issue in British Columbia, were so anti-Harper because he was bringing in these corporate apparatus and getting it ready for banking and private shares and all those things you have to do to actually legalize it. So it was the Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, who put that in place. And all he had to do was just say, this is a path to legalization, and remove that from the quiver for Trudeau. And I wish he had, because I think seriously, like that particular issue, we're paying for it today, and we're going to pay for it for decades to come, not only in relationships with, like, say, the U.S. and NAFTA, but I think it was a horrible mistake in terms of what they're doing in terms of cannabis.
With his incompetence and NAFTA pipeline. I just did a column for the Sun, Toronto Sun this week, and Looked at all 82 bills that Trudeau has put before Parliament. He's only passed 47 of them. 22 of those were basically pro forma bills to keep spending money or pass parts of the budget, which means there were 25 bills, and most of them were virtue signaling or giving citizenship back to terrorists or rewarding his union buddies, things like that. And you know, there's two of them on pot, but one of them could be called the Defense Lawyers Retirement Fund Act. It's just going to make defense lawyers very wealthy. This guy's been a disaster, but there's one bill, and I'd like your thoughts on this before I let you go, Brent. Brent Stafford with us, and please do share on Facebook and on Twitter and elsewhere, and share these things around. Brent, the Bill C-69 is the Impact Assessment Act, and the Pipeline Association says this will kill off any future pipelines. Speaking to other people in the industries, and they're saying that this new Environmental Assessment Impact Act is going to shut down mining, forestry, oil exploration, natural gas exploration, and it hasn't passed yet. These guys are coming for the natural resources. It really is Jerry Butts and his World Wildlife Federation leave the oil in the ground mentality taking hold.
Yeah, it's hard to really understand exactly what the end game is on that, because they damn well know that we can't get around on tricycles, for one thing. And obviously, everything that gets made, if it isn't growing above the ground, we have to dig into the ground to get it. And I don't know if these guys have seen the kinds of machines and dump trucks and how huge they are to actually move earth around, but it's not a toy, and it can't run off of wind and solar. So, I mean, there's a reason why fossil fuels, it all comes down to this, Brian, and this will be a big conversation to have at another time. But fossil fuels obviously are responsible for the Industrial Revolution. They underpin the entire society we live in. And if you disdain humanity, if you disdain everything about capitalism, you attack the fuel. And so that's what they're doing. They're attacking the fuel of Western civilization.
All right, Brent, thanks so much for joining us tonight. And do make sure that you check out Brent's work at the Nectarine and elsewhere. Thanks for the time.
Thanks, Brian.
All right, back in just a moment. We'll wrap up. Stick with me. All right. So that was a great conversation with Brent. Hadn't talked to him before. We're going to have to do that again. Look, getting ready to go live on my radio show at News Talk 580 CFRA. We're going to go in depth on this issue that has really gripped Ontario today. A Superior Court judge ruling that the province, yeah, sure, they had the constitutional right to change the ward boundaries in Toronto and change how many councillors and all of that. But guess what? It violated the Constitution. How? It violated the freedom of expression of both candidates and voters. One of the weirdest things I've ever heard. So I'll go in depth on that. There's a great column that you've got to see where I go through Trudeau's record. You can find it on all of my social media platforms on how little Trudeau's actually done. And on one level, as a conservative, I should definitely be happy about that. But on another level, I'm annoyed that these guys are just posturing and giving money to terrorists and giving citizenship back to terrorists and rewarding their union buddies. And, you know, the rest of us go to hell. So do check that out. But let me warn you that we're going to talk about this either later this week on the Nectarine or next week. There is this bill, and I mentioned it with Brent, is that there's this bill called Bill C-69 that will have a huge impact on our ability to extract natural resources in this country. It is called the Impact Assessment Act, and it hasn't received an awful lot of attention, but it should. This is an act that will shut down pipelines in the future. It will shut down mining, natural resources, forestry, all these things that pay for all the social programs that the leftists want. It pays for all of those. It's going to be shut down. Why? Because of virtue signaling, because of posturing by Justin Trudeau. He says it's going to make things more efficient. You talk to anybody in industry, and they will tell you the exact opposite. So watch for that coming to the Nectarine over the next few days. Thanks for joining us today. I got to cut it short, got to run, got to get ready to do radio. 3 hours of talking. After this, it's going to be a lot, but you can join me, CFRA.com or the iHeartRadio app, and make sure you're following me on social media and keep checking out the Nectarine. Thanks for joining us tonight.